Better move that over. Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today we take stock of where things stand with the drug provisions implemented in the Inflation Reduction Act. I want to say at the outset that Congress needs to work to address high drug prices. Thankfully, this committee historically has a track record of working in a bipartisan fashion to address this issue. But most of the medical drug pricing provisions signed into law by the Inflation Reduction Act raise serious concerns. That legislation was ostensibly to allow negotiations for the price of Medicare drugs through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Drug Price Negotiation Program. This would allow government bureaucrats to so-called negotiate Medicare drug prices. However, the scheme as written is unconstitutional. Recently, President Biden named the first 10 prescription drugs that will be subject to the so-called negotiation. I call it so-called negotiation because it's not true negotiation. It is a Godfather, mafia-style negotiation where bureaucrats at CMS make companies an offer they cannot refuse. A drug manufacturer has two options. One, voluntarily negotiate and face an excise tax of up to 95% of gross sales for that drug if they do not comply with the government's demands. Two, if the drug manufacturer doesn't wish to voluntarily negotiate, they are forced to withdraw all their drugs from Medicare and also Medicaid. Reiterating, a drug company is forced to either accept the drug price the government gives them out of the goodness of the government's heart, or the government will take up to 95% of gross sales from that drug. Or if they refuse to negotiate, the manufacturer loses access to Medicare and Medicaid. The federal government, through Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP, controls almost 40% of the legal drug sales in the United States. Last week, Health and Human Services responded to legal action claiming that participation in Medicare drug price negotiation is voluntary and that the program does not compel participation. But you must participate or lose access to 40%, almost 40% of the U.S. market on all of your medications. And if you participate, you have virtually no bargaining power. The federal government can take from a private company more money on a medicine than the private company receives or makes from that medicine, unless the private company agrees to the offer they cannot afford to refuse. The private pharmaceutical company is just like the movie producer Jack Woltz in the film The Godfather. Take the government offer or else. This law clearly violates the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment. I raised this concern in 2019 when the bill was first presented. No matter how much elaborate wordplay big government apologist lawyers want to use in calling the plan a form of negotiation does not make it true. The fancy words do not change the fact their scheme is a taking. To paraphrase an old saying, calling a skunk by any other name does not make it smell any better. When a competing Republican measure with similar language was briefly brought forward, I voted against that one too on constitutional grounds. Moreover, the Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service warned that the price-setting regime in the Inflation Reduction Act was on constitutionally weak legs. There are now 9 legal cases challenging this drug price negotiation program. I am confident that one or more of these lawsuits will be successful and this program will be found to be unconstitutional. This hearing will help us in Congress to understand the aspects of the price control scheme that are most harmful to patients and innovation so that we can craft constitutional bipartisan legislation that brings relief on drug prices without crushing drug research and development. One study says 24 to 49 therapies currently on the market would not be available today if the Inflation Reduction Act was in place during their development. These therapies could range anywhere from cancer, rare diseases, or MS drugs. As our witnesses can testify to today, small molecule drugs and biologic drugs used to treat rare diseases are among those treatments most impacted by the Inflation Reduction Act. Patients rely on the incredible innovation we have had in the U.S., and the provisions we are talking about today will make the U.S. second rate in the world when it comes to the realm of new drug development. We know the American people want lower prices on the most expensive prescription drugs, but we shouldn't sacrifice access to life-changing treatments in the process. That's why it's so important for Congress to fix the worst impacts of the drug pricing negotiation program, and in a manner that is consistent with the United States Constitution. I yield back and now recognize my colleague, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Castor, for her 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the first time, Americans who rely on Medicare will enjoy lower prices for their prescription drugs, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act that Democrats passed last Congress. Finally, 20 years after Part D was passed, we put people over to politics and empowered HHS to negotiate lower costs for life-saving drugs, ensuring that older Americans will enjoy lower prices and peace of mind. Already, many Americans are enjoying the $35 per month cap on insulin and no-cost vaccines pursuant to the Inflation Reduction Act. That has translated into a savings of about $440 annually for thousands of my neighbors in the Tampa Bay area. And starting in 2025, no senior will pay more than $2,000 in out-of-pocket cost annually for their prescriptions. So when fair and negotiated prices for the highest cost drugs are finalized in coming years, seniors will enjoy even more money back into their pockets. Mr. Chairman, the Department of Defense negotiates drug prices. The Veterans Administration negotiates drug prices. Now HHS will negotiate fair and reasonable prices according to the detailed process established by Congress that is similar to the way that HHS negotiates for every other product and service that Medicare pays for. Lifting the bar negotiation was long overdue. After all, Americans pay more for prescription drugs than citizens of other countries. Why? Because other countries negotiate fair prices, and they consider the clinical benefits and the effectiveness of prescription drugs. Americans deserve the same. Big Pharma outlandishly claims that the Constitution gives them the right to charge out-of-control, take-it-or-leave-it prices on prescription drugs. That is absurd. There is no constitutional right for drug companies to dictate the price of life-saving drugs to American taxpayers, especially when participation by drug companies in the negotiation is voluntary. For decades, Big Pharma has peddled the canard that exorbitantly high prices are necessary to support research and development. But the truth is that soaring profits, huge marketing budgets, and generous shareholder returns far exceed what the pharmaceutical companies invest in R&D. From 2019 to 2021, the 5 biggest pharmaceutical companies spent $13 billion more on giveaways to shareholders than they did on R&D. And the industry spent $8 billion on direct-to-consumer advertising last year alone. While 1 in 4 Americans report that they struggled to pay for their prescriptions, each of the 15 highest paid pharma CEOs made over $15 million in base salary, bonuses, and stock options in 2021. So the pharmaceutical giants don't like the change that's coming to their bottom lines. They're fighting in courts across the country to stop the savings for everyday Americans, even as their CEOs rake in millions of dollars year after year. Furthermore, drugs will only be subject to negotiations between 9 and 13 years after coming to market, giving manufacturers nearly a decade to recover their investments. And now Republicans in Congress are parroting industry talking points. But the nonpartisan CBO has debunked the claim that innovation will suffer, finding that the law's impact on the development of new drugs will be minimal, while the savings to taxpayers will be immense. Many analysts agree that the new structure provides an incentive to innovate. Now drug manufacturers need to make sure that their product offers real clinical benefits to justify their prices. At a time when MAGA Republicans are threatening a costly government shutdown, it's important to remind everyone that granting Medicare the authority to negotiate reasonable drug prices is fiscally responsible. Medicare negotiation is estimated to save $100 billion over 10 years, and these savings will allow Medicare to provide additional benefits to seniors and further reduce out-of-pocket costs. And if Republicans truly cared about innovation, they wouldn't be threatening to cut NIH's budget by as much as $2.8 billion next year. The majority has titled this hearing, "At What Cost?" I have to reflect upon the time Medicare Part D was passed in 2003, when you barred HHS from negotiating prices. Many people, including myself, were appalled that the lead negotiator in Congress left to become the president of Big Pharma at a salary of millions of dollars. It stunk to high heaven and is one of the reasons I ran for Congress. I urge my Republican colleagues not to throw a wrench into this critical reform. Our neighbors have waited too long enough for fair prices for important medications. I look forward to the debate on this issue, and the American people are depending on us to deliver for them. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. The chair will now recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for a 5-minute opening statement, but I'm sure Ms. Rogers will acknowledge before the clock starts that long before Big Pharma ever had a chance to read this bill, I called it unconstitutional. Chairman Rogers.
I do remember that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In many ways, this hearing feels like deja vu. Just last Congress, we repeatedly warned the Democrats that their drug pricing control scheme was going to do immense harm to patients by crushing drug innovation. Earlier this month, President Biden named the first 10 drugs that will be subjected to CMS's price controls in a big celebration at the White House. However, in the months and weeks leading up to President Biden's announcement, we saw a steady stream of terrible news for patients in need of hope. One after another, company after company started to issue announcements that began, "We're discontinuing phase 1 trials for a promising cancer drug. We will not launch a phase 3 trial for a drug to treat Stargardt disease. We are now carefully considering whether to seek a second rare disease indication. We will delay our launch. We will not be seeking a second indication. We are abandoning further investigation." And these announcements go on and on. We've cataloged dozens such announcements since the IRA's passage, and with the list of the first 10 drugs finally out, there's certain to be more. Each one of these doleful announcements represents a window of hope closing. Hope for many patients, families, and caregivers. Americans rightfully expect to have the earliest possible access to the most effective innovation and treatments and cures. We are a country of believers, and American biomedical innovation gives people battling a disease or illness a fighting chance at life. This was the greatest bipartisan balance achieved by Hatch-Waxman, a framework that provided incentives to make massive private sector investments in research and development while allowing for competition to drive down prices after a drug has been on the market. Was it perfect? Of course not. Are there bad actors who abused patent protections and gamed the system? Absolutely. But it did ensure that Americans got cutting-edge treatments and cures, sometimes years before people in other developed countries that have government price controls. I am deeply concerned that because of the so-called Innovation Reduction Act, the American people will not have the same fighting chance for a host of serious diseases. Instead, they will join people in so many other countries, like the UK and Canada, where unelected bureaucrats, not cutting-edge, science-backed with entrepreneurial innovation, dictate the value of new cures. And that's why I'm looking forward to hearing from patient advocates and caregivers like Mr. Crowley, Mr. John Czwartacki, individuals who are on the front lines. Thank you for being here. And from people like Dr. Potts, who have dedicated their lives to not just researching cancer, but fighting it. There's going to be a successful cancer moonshot. It's not going to be done by the National Institutes of Health or ARPA-H alone. A bulk of the work is going to be done by private industry and the innovators in private industry, people like Dr. Potts, who spent years and billions of dollars translating basic research into life-saving treatments. So this brings me back to why this hearing is so important. Last Congress, With a bipartisan vote, this committee stopped Speaker Pelosi's government price controls in H.R. 3. And then the so-called Inflation Reduction Act was passed on a party line vote through budget reconciliation. It short-circuited the hard bipartisan work of lowering drug prices for all Americans while preserving innovation. And instead, Democrats passed the buck to Secretary of HHS and CMS and gave bureaucrats virtually unlimited discretion to dictate the price of a negotiation-eligible drug. Congress's failure to do the hard work has created a whole host of consequences. As Chairman Griffith mentioned, the drug price negotiation program is currently being challenged in court on constitutional grounds. We will see what the courts have to say, but I share Chairman Griffith's belief that, at least in part, this legislation will be found to be unconstitutional. And when that happens, this committee will stand ready to do the hard work of building bipartisan solutions that lower drug prices without sacrificing innovation and America's biomedical edge. I thank the witnesses for being here. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Let me just start out by saying, please, don't pay any attention to anything that the Republicans are saying. They don't care about innovation. They don't care about whether people can buy the drugs or not. They're just doing the bidding of the pharmaceutical companies. I have no idea why. I'm not going to suggest why. But that's what this hearing is all about, doing the bidding of the pharmaceutical companies. Other countries, go to the other countries that are developed like us, Japan, UK, France. The drugs are so much cheaper, sometimes 4 or 5 times cheaper. People have access to drugs. People have access to health care. What's happening is that this country's healthcare system is broken, and it's not easy to have access. It's not affordable. This is the problem, and a big part of that is big pharma, because 20, 30 years ago, people didn't depend so much on drugs if they were sick or they needed to get care. But today, it's such a big part of their budget, of their healthcare budget. If we don't do something, more and more people are gonna not have access to drugs. There would be less innovation. Because of where we're going, not because of the Inflation Reduction Act, but because all of the other things that Republicans try to do to cut back on Medicaid, to repeal the ACA, the list goes on. So please understand that this is nothing more than an opportunity for the drug companies to come here and say why they're wonderful and why they care about everyone, and the only thing they care about is the bottom line, how much money they're gonna make. We're only in this mess, and I was here, I don't know how many other people were, because 2 decades ago, the congressional Republicans barred the federal government from negotiating prices on behalf of Medicare beneficiaries. If they hadn't barred and done the bidding of Big Pharma then the government couldn't negotiate prices like any other government does in other developed countries that are comparable to us. But they specifically said that they couldn't negotiate prices because they wanted to make sure that the pharmaceutical companies made more money, and their executives and their shareholders. That's what this is all about. The Inflation Reduction Act finally brought an end to that, lowering costs and making life-saving medicines more affordable for Americans by empowering the government to finally negotiate prices for the most expensive drugs for Medicare beneficiaries. And what we should be doing is putting up a bill, which myself and others have sponsored, which take this beyond Medicare to the private market. What we need to do, and we'll do that, when we're in a position to do as Democrats, is to take this same legislation that was in the Inflation Reduction Act and move it so it applies to private industry, to private insurance companies, to the ACA, and everything else. That's what we need to do. Expand this. This is a great idea to try to negotiate lower prices that can be applied outside the Medicare market. And I pledge, as long as I'm here, that's my goal. So understand that. Now, let me just say, I'm not going to go through all the different reasons and how much money we saved. I just have to say this, that for a party, the Republicans that have shown itself willing to shut down the government under the auspices of creating savings, I would expect them to celebrate the Inflation Reduction Act's cost-saving provisions. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that Medicare drug price negotiation will save the government and taxpayers $98.5 billion over the next 10 years. We're not going to let them get away with repealing this. We're not going to let them get away to get the courts to say it's unconstitutional. We will fight tooth and nail. The Biden administration is moving full steam ahead with the implementation of the law. Last month, the administration announced the 10 drugs. There'll be more. In fact, I wanted it to be more. We had to cut back on it. But if you look at the bill that we've introduced, we would increase the numbers on an annual basis that would be selected for negotiation. I don't want to go into more details about, how much money this saves or what it does. I just think it's very sad that Republicans have firmly aligned themselves with the drug industry or bringing outlandish legal challenges against the Biden administration, desperate attempts to block the law and preserve their ability to rip off Americans. Republicans know that this massively popular drug pricing reforms will only gain more support as families across the country continue to experience the savings it creates. This is just going to be like the ACA. The more people find it, the more people will love it, and then the Republicans won't be able to repeal it anymore. So let's move on. Let's expand this. Let's not buy into the nonsense that's being sold today that somehow this is going to, limit innovation or make it more difficult for people to access drugs. That's just a misinformation campaign that they're going to continue with, but they'll lose. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. That concludes members' opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written and opening statements will be made a part of the record. Please provide those to the clerk promptly. We want to thank our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to testify before this subcommittee. You will have the opportunity to give an opening statement followed by a round of questions from members. Our witnesses today are Mr. Czwartacki, with founder of Survivors for Solutions, Dr. Steve Potts, chair of the Drug Development Council International Cancer Advocacy Network, Mr. John Crowley, executive chairman of Amicus Therapeutics, and Dr. Aaron S. Kesselheim, professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. We appreciate you all being here today and look forward to hearing from you. You're aware the committee is holding an oversight hearing, and when doing so, we have the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do any of you have an objection to taking testimony or testifying under oath?
No.
Seeing no objection, we'll move forward. The chair advises you that you're also entitled to be advised by counsel pursuant to House rules. Do any of you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today?
No.
Seeing none, if you would please rise and raise your right hand. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Seeing the witnesses have all answered or nodded in the affirmative, you are now sworn in and under oath, subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. With that, we will now recognize Mr. John Czwartacki for his 5 minutes to give an opening statement. And if you need a little bit extra time, we'll be flexible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Griffith and Ranking Member Castor and members of this committee. I'm honored to testify today to share how important innovation is and the hope it provides to millions, to me, and millions of patients like me. First, I want to say how much personal respect I have for this committee, and especially the U.S. House, where I had my first job after college. I was young, healthy, and saw myself as indestructible, rarely getting even a cold. I wasn't a patient, I was impatient for life to get going. In fact, it was right across the street while working in 1100 Longworth when I had my first MS symptom. Without warning, I lost sight in my right eye, left eye. I was 23, diagnosed with MS, with multiple sclerosis. Later that year, 1993, I was the first disease-modifying treatment, or DMT, was approved for MS. Prior to this, generations of MS patients suffered their cruel disease with little hope of relief. Then, a specific drug interferon was discovered to slow progression of disease for many patients, many but not all. A flywheel of innovation was set in motion 10 years earlier. Back in 1984, a long, hard-fought compromise was reached between ideological opposites, Liberal Democrat Henry Waxman, right up there, and conservative Republican Orrin Hatch. The results were a pipeline of life-saving treatments, catapulting the U.S. from a laggard in medical discovery to its undisputed global leader. I was put on the only DMT approved for MS once my symptoms began escalating. Numbness in my torso, face and hands, pins and needles, minor stuff, mostly invisible, just background noise. The problem was, despite being proven effective for many MS patients, it wasn't working for me. As I began a new job in the Senate, the attacks got so severe they became impossible to ignore. Hospitalized for weeks, moved to a nursing home, I was suffering from unpredictable seizures. I couldn't walk or even safely swallow. I was 28. I was supposed to be on life's launch pad, not in long-term care. 60 years too soon. My parents saw how dejected I was and offered to help. They rented a hospital bed and moved me back into my childhood home. Thankfully, a second DMT for MS was recently been approved. On May 1st, 1998, I began daily injections. They took a few weeks to kick in, but once they did, my life began again. My body was finally getting a break from my own haywire immune system. Combined with targeted physical therapy, rest, and prayer, I was able to move out of my parents' basement, regain a meaningful career, and meet my future wife and start a family. In short, the drug saved my life in every way possible. We were soon a family of 6, blessed with 4 healthy and active boys. I was living a dream. Baseball games, hockey practice, and homemade hoverboards that defined my life for 20 years, not my MS. Not surprisingly, after two decades, the treatment began to lose effectiveness. I would need 2 more breakthrough drugs, both recently discovered, to keep me mostly upright and productive. I'm here today to remind you that policy choices made in this town have real impact on real patients. You need to understand lives are changed by policies you create. Sometimes, like in my case, for the better. But this time, I'm afraid, for the worse. Being a government nerd, I read the almost 300 pages of price control pages of the IRA, a bill pushed by one side of the aisle with little public debate. I became enraged. It's a sick experiment on people who are sick with disease. No study on the policy to see if it's safe and effective. No clinical trial to check if it has painful side effects. The only certain outcome is an end to the policy that I credit for saving my life and create a medical miracle machine, I should say. So instead of spreading hope, the government is now rationing out doses of despair. If you can fix this, first do no harm wasn't your thing last year, but it's not too late. When you're in a hole, you can stop digging. Stop doubling down on a policy that is taking hope from those who need it most. I can never repay the unnamed research scientists who are responsible for my wonderful life. What I can do is stand up for the unheard patient. I can remind policymakers that cost can be a problem, but it's not the problem. Illness is the problem. And while a cure never discovered shows savings on a CBO spreadsheet, nothing is more costly than a loved one losing their life. Here's a little secret. I'm here today, not just for me and my kids, not just for the families at St. Jude's, or even your folks back home. It's for everyone, including you and those young staffers behind you, because I was you guys when I faced the hard truth. We're not indestructible. We're all patients. We're, are, or will be. I'm honored to have a chance to share my story and speak up for patient hope, because ultimately, it's hope that matters most. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony, and now recognize Dr. Potts for his 5-minute opening statement.
Chairwoman McMorris Rogers, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Members Castor and Pallone, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Dr. Steve Potts, a biotech scientist and small business entrepreneur. I've been working on cancer drug development for the last 25 years. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the IRA and the impact specifically its 9-year small molecule penalty is having on new drugs for cancer and other diseases. There's two kinds of medicines we work to generally develop into drugs. Small molecules, these are pills taken orally, and biologics, which are typically given IV or as injectables. Small molecules are just as risky to develop as large molecules. They can cross the blood-brain barrier and also enter cancer cells typically. Biologics cannot. These powerful weapons both attack cancer, but they're not interchangeable. Roughly half the new oncology drugs approved recently were small molecule treatments. We need both kinds of drugs to win the war against cancer. We are cutting off the development of novel small molecules for America's seniors at the knees with the IRA 9-year small molecule penalty. But this is a problem we can fix together in a revenue-neutral way by having the government negotiate the prices of both small and large molecules after 13 years, along with an increase in a minimum statutory discount that can more than pay for this adjustment. Most ideas for cancer drugs never make it past animal testing. Of the ones that do make it into human trials, less than 5%, 1 in 20, actually make it to market. It takes a decade of work by largely American companies to do so. We have to spend a minimum of $200,000 per patient on direct clinical trial costs alone that goes largely to American academic medical centers and hospitals. I've personally worked in these trials at many of the top institutions in your district. But regardless, one successful drug in 30 years of post-Ph.D. drug hunting is considered a productive career. And getting even one over the finish line is a huge and endless contribution to society. I know the drugs that I've worked on will be available to patients forever, and most patients who take them will take inexpensive generic copies long after their patents expire. And we count on insurance to make our inventions affordable. It's impossible otherwise. That's what keeps us motivated. This is the essence of the biotech social contract. My own career is a good illustration. Since completing my Ph.D. at UC Davis in 1999, that's 25 years of work. I've been involved in 2 successful drugs that are currently given to patients, and a whole lot of failures that didn't work. I'm one of the lucky ones. But neither of these 2 drugs are blockbusters. They're the typical drugs. They're novel new mechanisms, critical differences to patients, but these are not the blockbusters that is the focus of many of today's discussions. Biotech fundraising is like Shark Tank for nerds. I usually have just a few minutes to explain to a room full of sharp and smart investors what our molecule does, why I believe our data in mice will translate to results in people, and generally, hopefully, convince investors that my team and I know mostly what we're doing. I do this many times and expect to hear a lot of no thanks. The cancer companies that do get funded almost always have to demonstrate economically and clearly that the drug is, if it's approved, will more than pay back its cost and savings elsewhere in the health system. Think of a drug that fights bladder cancer and avoids the patient having to have the high cost of surgery, the bladder removal, hospitalization, and then the horrible cost of living without a bladder every day, year in, year out. About a year ago, while out fundraising for cutting-edge cancer drug candidate, I noticed a fundamental shift by investors away from small molecules, especially for diseases that affect older Americans. This is a real investment question I had during a pitch. Is there any way you can change from a small molecule daily pill for these cancers to making it a more complex biologic IV or injectable? That's ridiculous. A request to go from a pill to an injectable. And I puzzled. I did my own survey of over 100 venture capitalists and biotech leaders. The damage has been clear. 85%, 6 out of 7 biotech investors were already pivoting and making plans away from small molecule drug development. Other studies reached the same conclusion. Biotech investors have to get a return on their risk, and the elimination of 4 years, between 9 and 13, before price negotiation cuts their potential return in half. Any rational investor would leave the small molecule space faced with these alternatives, and they will leave the biologic space too if we further try to mess with an already shortened 13-year patent-like period of market-based pricing. The cancer of the IRA small molecule penalty will continue to metastasize, eliminating previously promising drug programs in cancer, neuroscience, orphan diseases, and many other areas. I can't imagine anyone in this room who deliberately designed IRA to have this kind of toxic side effect on small molecule drug development, but that is our reality. I'm supportive of many aspects of the IRA, including the way it begins to address high patient out-of-pocket costs, as well as how it ensures that the prices society pays for biologic medicines come down after an initial patent-protected period of market-based pricing. That's long been the bargain. The drug industry makes medicines that are meant to go generic without undue delay, and society makes them affordable to patients through proper insurance, which means low out-of-pocket costs. The best aspects of the IRA reaffirm this bargain. We can balance biotech affordability and innovation. We can mitigate this central toxic effect of the IRA. Policymakers can restore sufficient incentives for new molecule R&D simply by having the government treat small and large molecules the same after 13 years. An increase in the minimum statutory discount can more than pay for this adjustment. Please, come together to fix this. Our progress in treating and curing cancers and other diseases of aging depend on it.
Chairman yields back and now recognize Mr. Crowley for his 5-minute opening statement.
Great, thank you very much, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, Chair McMorris-Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to present these comments to the committee as it examines the very real-world and negative effects that certain provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act are having on biomedical innovation and the chilling and immediate effect it is having, especially on smaller, entrepreneurial biotechnology companies in the United States. I'll also comment on the negative effects the law is having on patient access to novel, often life-saving therapies. My comments this afternoon focus in particular on the field of rare disease research and drug development, as well as the IRA's disincentives to continue to invest in important small molecule technologies. My testimony comes from a very personal perspective and unintended journey into the world of science and medicine. 25 years ago, our family's life changed. First, our then 15-month-old daughter, Megan, was diagnosed with Pompe disease, a rare and fatal neuromuscular genetic disorder. Weeks later, we received the news that our 1-month-old son, Patrick, also had Pompe. We were devastated to learn that most babies with this disease died before the age of 2, and that few lived to be kindergartners. Over the next 2 years, Megan and Patrick got progressively weaker, needing wheelchairs to maneuver and ventilators to breathe. Finally, realizing that time was our greatest challenge, I quit my job, took a home equity loan and cash advances on our credit cards, and together with a pioneering researcher, I co-founded a small biotechnology company to develop a medicine for Pompe. Despite many setbacks, with the remarkable work of so many, we succeeded. Megan and Patrick began to receive a life-saving enzyme replacement therapy in early 2003. It has saved their lives. They are now 27 and 26 years old, and despite the ravages of the disease from not having a medicine for the first years of their life, Megan went on to graduate from the University of Notre Dame and earn a master's in social work degree from the University of North Carolina. She works now at the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Patrick now works in a flower store staffed by all people living with disabilities. While our family's journey has received much attention, we are not alone. What science and medicine provided to our family and continues to provide is hope. Millions more living with rare, devastating diseases need that same hope today, and they need it really fast. There are nearly 10,000 rare diseases. Collectively, they afflict almost 30 million people here in the United States. About 95% of these disorders have no treatment, and many are not even being researched. This is a public health crisis of epic proportions. Thankfully, though, we are on the dawn of a golden age in genetic medicine. Exciting new therapies like gene therapies, gene editing, precision-based small molecules offer hope today where for so many, for so long, there has been none. We should be constantly seeking ways to encourage massive private capital flows to fund biotechnology companies and entrepreneurs. We need to incentivize our largest biopharmaceutical companies to invest in these rare disease programs. Simply stated, we need to do all that we can to break down barriers and to accelerate research and development. But now, rather than declaring a public health crisis and applying an Operation Warp Speed for rare diseases, we face a new headwind with the IRA. The development of new medicines takes many years of research and faces long odds of success. At our company, Amicus, over the years, we have had many more programs and clinical studies fail than succeed. Drug discovery broadly and rare disease research especially are inherently filled with tremendous risk. But at Amicus, we would rather be the first to fail than the last to succeed. All this comes at a time, together now with the IRA challenges, that have been the most difficult 2.5 years in the history of the biotech industry. There are 3,000 biotech companies in the United States, the vast majority of which have no approved products or revenues, let alone any profitability. These companies, though, originate more than 75% of all new medicines. We are the cradle of biomedical innovation, and the American biotech sector is the envy of the world and an incredibly important strategic advantage for our nation. But as emerging entrepreneurial companies, so many now are struggling. Access to private capital needed for research and development is difficult. In the rare disease space alone, more than 100 clinical programs have been canceled in just the past 18 months. We cannot squander this great opportunity in the years ahead to advance the state-of-the-art medicines for people in need, especially the most vulnerable among us. And the United States must not relinquish this great strategic advantage that is American biotechnology. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Dr. Kesselheim for his 5-minute opening statement.
Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, thank you for inviting me to speak today about the Inflation Reduction Act and how it reduces excessive spending and supports patient access to drugs. I'll also address why we should not expect negative effects on innovation, but rather why the IRA actually supports meaningful drug development. Patients pay far more for brand-name drugs in the U.S. than in comparable countries. As a result, 3 in 10 say they can't afford their drugs, which leads to non-adherence and bad clinical outcomes. The U.S. is the only industrialized nation where we let drug companies price drugs at whatever level they want. As a result, median drug launch prices increased from $2,000 a year in 2008 to over $180,000 a year in 2021. Then we give drug companies protection from direct competition with patents and other exclusivities lasting a median of about 15 years, with 1 in 4 drugs lasting over 17 years. Over the last decade, median net earnings were about twice as much for large drug companies as for non-drug companies. The IRA now enables Medicare to negotiate the price of medications it pays for just as it does for all other goods and services. Negotiation is designed to reflect a drug's clinical value and lead to a fair price, not a rock-bottom price, which could at first be as little as 25% less than the manufacturer's set price. It'll cover drugs for which Medicare spends over $200 million a year that have been on the market for at least 9 to 13 years. No negotiation is projected to save the country about $100 billion over the next 10 years, money that Congress has used to cap patient out-of-pocket costs in Part D for seniors. Concerns that the IRA could reduce innovation are overblown. The CBO found that negotiations could lead to as little as 1% fewer new drug approvals over the next 30 years, with the drugs affected most likely to be those offering limited added benefits. I want to quickly address 3 specific innovation concerns. First, that the IRA might lead companies to delay launching promising cancer drugs for rare indications until they get shown to work in more common indications. This is not only ethically appalling, it's economically flawed. Such a strategy would reduce the amount of effective patent life for drugs, meaning that it would have fewer years of strong protection against generics after it hits the market, which lower prices far more than Medicare negotiation. Second, the industry argues that the IRA reduces innovation for rare diseases, but the Act has a specific exclusion for drugs approved for a single rare disease, and most rare disease drugs are also approved for other rare diseases or common ones. Drugs approved for rare diseases aren't necessarily financially disadvantaged. In a study, we found that median 5-year net sales for new drugs were as high for drugs for rare diseases as they were for common disease drugs. Third, industry executives argue that starting negotiation at 9 years for small molecule drugs disadvantages them versus a 13-year start date for biologics. This is both scientifically and economically flawed. Small molecule drugs still have numerous biochemical advantages. According to the trade organization biologics R&D is a high-risk endeavor with higher capital costs, higher material costs, greater manufacturing costs and uncertainties, longer development times, lower late-stage success rates as compared to small molecule drugs. Among small molecule drugs being negotiated this year, global revenues in their first 9 years ranged from $15 billion to $57 billion per drug. Eliquis alone will have made over $100 billion before negotiated prices take effect. It would be absurd for a pharmaceutical manufacturer to set aside drug innovation that could lead to revenues at that level. Rather than buying these arguments, this committee should recognize how IRA negotiation offers the prospect of real improvements to drug innovation. By allowing manufacturers to charge high prices indefinitely for ho-hum products, The current system incentivizes manufacturers to invest vast sums in maintaining the revenue streams on their current products. Negotiation after 9 to 13 years changes the calculus, favoring investment in meaningful and new innovation over product hopping and drug evergreening. Negotiating prices for prescription drugs based on a drug's clinical benefits compared to therapeutic alternatives, as the IRA does, will direct more manufacturer effort towards meeting unmet medical needs or providing meaningful clinical benefits, while reducing spending on drugs that lack these characteristics. The IRA, by the way, does all this without violating any constitutional provisions. Contrary to industry claims, the IRA's procedures satisfy the Due Process Clause. They are not a Fifth Amendment taking of any sort because private healthcare entities have no legal right to receive taxpayer dollars, and they do not unconstitutionally compel participation. And contrary to perhaps the most outlandish claim of all, it is not a violation of free speech. Rather, the IRA brings the U.S. in line with other countries and brings drugs in line with every other service and product Medicare covers to reduce excessive government spending, promotes innovation of new drugs, and most crucially of all, improves access to important brand name drugs by seniors in Medicare. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll now move into the question and answer portion of the hearing. I will begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. It is interesting when we talk about the takings clause because we argued this a number of times in this committee and in the full committee and in the health committee. And in the last hearing that we had in the Energy and Commerce full committee, I looked over to my colleagues. We were in the minority then, so I looked this way. I looked over to my colleagues on the Democrat side of the aisle and I said, if I'm wrong on the Constitution, somebody please bring me a case that shows that I'm wrong. Still waiting on the case. Now, I will also reference that in the British Army of the 1700s, rank-and-file soldiers often just stole what they needed. But even before the American Revolution, British officers, in the name of the king, would negotiate with a merchant or a farmer. The officer would offer what he thought was fair. If you refused his offer, so be it. He would just take what he needed. They negotiated before they took it. America wanted to be better. Now, I'm personally not against negotiation, but my friend, and I hope we can be friends even though we disagree, Dr. Kesselheim just raised a great example. I'm on Xarelto. I'm eligible for Medicare, I'm not on it yet. Eliquis is the competing drug. There are two medicines that solve the same medical problem. Real negotiation, which I'm not against, would say that we put the test to them and say, which one of you can provide Medicare with this drug that is truly transformational for people with blood clotting issues? But both of them work. So why not negotiate and say, bring me your lowest price? That's real negotiation, not what we currently have. Dr. Potts, talking about this 95% excise tax on the gross receipts, would you invest in a company where a product had the chance to be taxed more than the gross sales of the product would produce in revenues?
Yeah, I mean, think about it from the...
And if you could pull your mic closer to you, and if all of you could make sure, we heard Mr. Crowley and Dr. Kesselheim fine, but if Mr. Czwartacki and you, Dr. Potts, could pull the mics a little closer so we can get more volume.
Sure, thank you. Think of that question from the point of view of an investor. And you're sitting, I say Shark Tank for nerds, you're sitting and thinking about investing in biotech or something else, and you say, look, you got a 1 in 20 shot of having the drug after it is first in human trials get approved. And you have a very low chance of even getting it to human trials. I've shut down a company that didn't make it that far. And then after that, you're going to say in 7 years from that point, you work so hard, the odds are so low. In 7 years, you're going to negotiate, you start the negotiation period. If you don't comply perfectly, 96% of your total sales, which we don't even see, not profit, sales could be eventually taxed. I mean, you can see why it's so hard right now to raise funding for small molecules for the elderly.
So your answer is you would not invest.
We're seeing it. 6 out of 7 VCs have said, we're going to make changes based on this.
Mr. Crowley?
Small molecules.
Would you invest?
It makes investment much more difficult and much more challenging, for sure. It presents another barrier to innovation. And I think that's important to realize that, investors are an important part of this ecosystem.
And because of the love of your children, you probably would have done the same thing today that you did then if you could change their lives. But as an investor on the sidelines, you wouldn't probably invest it. Is that correct?
It would make it much less likely, yes.
Yep. You know, countries like China and India have explicitly stated they want to become global leaders in medical innovation. I'm worried the drug price negotiation program will help make these countries more attractive for R&D and manufacturing investments than in the U.S. And of course, Europe has always been out there. Dr. Potts, are you seeing some of the companies starting to look to Europe to be where they do their innovation, or to China or India?
You know, when I started my career, Europe and the U.S. were about the same. Because of the Hatch-Waxman and the patent protection we put in place, the U.S. really pulled ahead. I'm very worried about China. I mean, you don't see China, basically slandering their biotech industry like what you see so typical across this United States. So yes, we are worried about it.
And they don't have to worry about investors because they have the Chinese Communist Party. Dr. Potts, on that as well, and Mr. Crowley, you believe that our leadership role is in jeopardy? And I think the answer is yes. Yes or no? Because my time's running out.
Yes, very much.
Okay.
Yes.
And Mr. Crowley, can you please explain how companies pursue new uses for older drugs, particularly cancer, and how the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act allow the so-called negotiations to start at 9 years for small molecule drugs and 13 years for biologicals, and how that will hinder the research there?
I think it's important to realize, Chairman, that when we're in our companies or in academia, we start with a disease, and we think about what are the best technologies to tackle that disease. We don't do these health economic analyses. It starts with the science, and we follow the science. What the IRA does with respect to 9 versus 13 years is to provide a bias for people looking at these programs, what they're going to cost and what the return would be, all the capital it takes. And when you look over that time, it's going to be biased against small molecules. And small molecules are incredibly important. As Dr. Potts said, it's 90% of new drugs are small molecules.
I'm running out of time. Lastly, if you would just raise your hand if any of you have been advising or in talks with CMS or HHS on the implementation of the provision in the Inflation Reduction Act. Seeing nobody has been involved in that? Just raise your hand if you have been, because I'm out of time. All right, seeing none, I will now yield back and recognize Ms. Castor, Ranking Member, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, in response to the new negotiation power for HHS to negotiate fair prices, it's obvious that Big Pharma has launched a strategic campaign. They filed at least 9 lawsuits that we know of. They have started a very costly PR campaign. They're instigating political hearings like this. But I have to say, Americans are seeing through it. They know now, they've watched for so many years how they're gouged in their drug prices. They pay more than other people across the world. They are bombarded with advertising constantly, and they probably wonder, well, why don't you put that money into R&D to develop? They know what the executive pay is. It's just exorbitant. So Dr. Kesselheim, why, put this into context financially for the pharmaceutical industry. Why are they working so aggressively to halt fair price negotiation?
Well, I mean, I think that for pharmaceutical companies that have very successful products that have made billions and billions of dollars over the course of almost a decade, the easiest way for them to make more money would be to invest in trying to extend the exclusivity period as long as possible for those products. And that is, in fact, what they do by building up large thickets of patents around those products and finding new formulations of them, or new, or hopping to other versions of them. And they try to extend their revenue streams for as long as possible. And so I think that because the Inflation Reduction Act introduces some measure of fair pricing after 9 to 13 years on the market and reduces that option, I think that makes the drug companies nervous that easy way of getting additional revenues is going to be lost.
I mean, this system is, when we're talking about incentives to develop life-saving drugs, it would seem the last thing that you would do would be to prohibit HHS from negotiating fair prices and their ability to take into account the clinical benefits of those drugs. The system right now, it just says, okay, Big Pharma, just sell those high-cost drugs for as much as possible and pump out the advertising so the consumers are constantly advertising for them. I mean, there's got to be an important incentive now that HHS has to take into account the clinical benefit and the effectiveness of these drugs. Good for the government and good for patients. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that that's a really important part of this discussion, is that the IRA doesn't make Medicare pay rock bottom prices across the board for every drug. What it does is it creates a process for negotiating and a drug based on the clinical benefits that it provides, what clinical alternatives there are, whether or not it's made back its research and development already, whether or not it addresses an unmet medical need, takes all of those into account in trying to come to a fair price that is more aligned with the benefits of the drug. And in doing so ensures that actual innovation will be paid for quite handsomely, and drugs that don't offer a lot of benefits will not. And so as a result, I think it moves innovation into more effective, more useful areas.
And isn't it something that Big Pharma cries poor on research and development when it's the American taxpayer that largely funds basic science and research in this country through the NIH? Can you talk about how, or quantify how much we're already benefiting the big drug companies based on how we fund NIH?
Sure. I mean, NIH provides a massive subsidy for pharmaceutical companies by supporting basically all basic science and a lot of translational science as well in its $60 billion or so a year budget. Studies have shown that basically every FDA-approved drug can be linked back to NIH funding, and we've shown in some of our work that about a quarter of drugs can even be linked to NIH funding in their late stages of development. In some cases, quite substantially. And what that investment does, is it identifies new areas for products. It de-risks a lot of the science at the riskiest times, so that when drug companies do get involved later in the process, there is less risk involved. And then, obviously they do invest substantial sums at those times, but it's less risky and it's closer to the development of the product. And so I think that all innovation ultimately relates back to some of these public, to this public funding.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gently yields back. Now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. McMorris-Rogers, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you all for your powerful testimony. I think I agree with CZ, right? That's what I'm allowed to call you.
Yes, please.
When you said hope matters most, and today what we are hearing is that the policy decisions have real-world impacts to people here in America and all around the world. American medical innovation has created so many miracles, many times giving people, loved ones, friends, hope at a time when that's all they have is hope for a cure, a breakthrough. So let's make sure we stay focused on the people. Dr. Potts, I want to start with you. In your testimony, you highlighted the potential challenges that the IRA poses to people that are waiting for cures and breakthroughs. Would you explain how the IRA might hinder innovation and what this could mean for future drug development?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the American people are not yet seeing the damage that this is going to cause. It's going to take a long time for that to roll out. What they're seeing is hearing is, oh, drugs are cheaper. Of course, that sounds great, but we're not seeing the long-term damage. Let's talk specifically about cancer. Let's take, like, for example, lung cancer, but any of these cancers are like this. We work on a drug to try to find a small population we're going to see benefit. And we work really hard with a small trial in that area. Then when we see, a hint of success, potentially we think about going for an approval there to really get experience using that drug. And you see some amazing results. It's called precision therapy. We see that across so many different flavors of cancer. Lung cancer's led the way, but there's others as well. From there, you then build on that, and you look for a larger population. There's no investor that's ever going to get their return by going after these small populations. You just think of those like orphan disease. The way that structure is set up, with only a 9 years, you get one orphan exclusion, so you stop there. And there's no investor that's going to say, great, I'm going to develop this drug for one small area, keeping in mind how much it takes to get that drug developed. And I think, the thing that's important to know is most of these drugs are $300 million of sales. That sounds like a lot, but it costs far more than that to develop. So that's the typical experience of most of these cancers. My cancer drug was like that. It was actually, you would actually call it a Me Too drug. It was actually second to come to market, but it has a very fundamental improvement over what was already there. So you're just seeing stifling across cancer with the orphan disease, and especially with the 9 years. You just don't have enough time to make back your
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. Thank you. Mr. Crowley, I wanted to ask you just for your insights as to the impact on your ability to provide innovative, effective medications to people, the potential for stifled innovation, and just any insights that you could share as far as American medical innovation versus UK, Europe, or China.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll give the example of what we've done at Amicus. So we started this, our second biotech company, to focus on rare diseases. For the one drug that we have now approved in the United States, it's a small molecule precision medicine. There's this belief that it's easy to develop small molecules. It's a very rare disease. It took us 13 years of clinical studies and more than $500 million to get that drug approved. It now helps more than 500 people with specific mutations living with Fabry disease. That was an incredibly difficult journey. We've now done the same thing in Pompe disease. We followed the science. We started with a small molecule. After 4 years, it failed. We went back to the drawing board. 7 years later, we went in the clinic, and God willing, in the next few days, we'll finally get FDA approval for a next-generation medicine in Pompe disease. That's cost us well over $500 million as well. Our company has in 19 years, we've not been profitable. We hope to be next year. And we're one of the success stories in biotechnology, again, with thousands of companies. I think it's important for the committee to understand this political rhetoric just has such a chilling effect on investors making their decisions, partly because they don't know when the next shoe is going to drop. And is it going to be worse? Is it going to be more difficult to make their investment decisions, provide us capital? I've never taken a dime from the NIH. The NIH is a really important part of the ecosystem, this virtuous circle of drug development. I know I've raised over $2 billion to develop medicines, most of which have failed in the clinic. So when I think about the IRA, there's the broad impact that it has, but also specific provisions we need to address, like multiple orphan indications that harm people with rare diseases in the 9 versus 13.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Mr. CZ, I just thank you for sharing your powerful story as a 39-year MS survivor, and just really the powerful impact of this policy on specific medications. Anything you want to add?
No, but I do want to say that we it's hard enough in America to be sick. We can't make it even harder to get well. And so by providing the option of the drug, we can at least give people the hope that they can recover from the illness and disease. I hear things like we should go back 30 years. Like there was no cure or any DMT for MS. That confines 500,000 Americans to no hope. And I have 4 kids. One of whom is about to be a second lieutenant in the Army, and he wouldn't be here today at all if I had no drug to keep me upright and above ground. So I just think that we need to keep moving forward through the American innovation miracle of this innovation, medical ecosystem that has provided so much hope and help for so many people. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, ranking member of the full committee.
Thank you, Chairman Griffith. My question is of Mr. Kesselheim, but just want everyone to understand where I'm coming from. I'm a capitalist. I have no problem with companies, pharma, making a lot of money, and that's fine. That's what this country is all about. We're capitalist, but it just seems so unfair to me, Mr. Kesselheim, that as you said, the pharmaceutical companies try to have as long an exclusivity period as possible, keep their things so that they can keep selling things exclusively. I mean, that's monopolistic. That's not capitalist. There's no competition, right? Then they say, we should be able to raise our prices as much as we want. The government shouldn't step in. And the whole idea is that, they should all this money should come to them through higher prices, through exclusivity. And then they're going to use all that profit to invest in innovation. But that's not the case. I mean, in other words, I have no way of guaranteeing that massive amounts of money that are going to go to the pharmaceuticals are going to be used for innovation. In fact, if we tried to legislate that, I'm sure my colleagues on the other side would say that's unconstitutional, right? Because it's against the marketplace. So meanwhile, in the rest of these countries in the world, they pay much less for drugs. They have a lot more access to the drugs. I think that what's happening in our country is that, we have fewer people that have access, and what did you say, 3 in 10 can't afford their drugs? So it's just not fair. It's very much the opposite of competition, the opposite of capitalism. It's basically saying, give us all the money, give us all the advantages through the patent system, exclusivity, and then, we'll spend it on innovation. But all that burden is on us. All that burden is on Americans, on our seniors, on the people that can't afford it. And then the rest of the countries go merrily down their way and take the advantages of this innovation and pay less and have no problem getting the drugs. It's just not fair. So that's my gripe. It's just not fair. I mean, I got to look out for my constituents, and they're saying, what are you doing here? Why are you letting them get away with this? And that's why we passed this provision in the Inflation Reduction Act. And I just have one question. In your testimony, you refute Big Pharma's arguments that exorbitant drug costs are simply the price we have to pay for access to novel drug treatments. And Republicans echo these claims, asserting that the Inflation Reduction Act unfairly disadvantages small molecule drugs, will cause a delay in new therapies, reduces incentives for drug innovation. Why should we buy these arguments, and why should we allow these high prices to continue? I just comment on what I said. 2 minutes, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think that I think it's important to recognize, and I also support capitalism and those principles, that the drug market is not a free market. This is not what we're talking about. Because in the drug market, what we have is where the government gives drug companies patents and other exclusivities that protects them from competition for, on average, about 15 years. And then we have insurance companies, insurance systems like Medicare that are required to cover the drugs. In Medicare Part D, there are protected classes like cancer where the Medicare Part D plans have to cover basically every FDA-approved drug. Medicaid has to cover every FDA-approved drug. And so if you have a system where you have protection from competition and a buyer that has to buy it, and then you don't have a free market, and it allows drug companies to charge whatever price they want for their drugs, and then sustain that price and raise that price over time without bringing new information to the market about those products. And so, in that system, I think the best way to try to deal with that is to try to ensure that that there is a process for negotiation. So that drugs can be paid for based on the benefits that they provide. And
then I'm going to interrupt you because there's only 30 seconds left. But then you take those savings under Medicare and you make smarter investments. Because Medicare isn't endless, right? So you take those savings and you make better investments for the good of those seniors and their health.
Absolutely, and that's what you did in the Inflation Reduction Act is you took the savings from negotiation and you put a cap on Medicare Part D out-of-pocket spending for seniors. And too much spending on drugs in Medicaid, it makes it so that states can't afford to provide other services for their patients, or they have to change their enrollment criteria for Medicaid to try to reduce their budgets. And so it is not a zero-sum game, and you have to think about what the trade-offs are for allowing drug companies to charge whatever they want for their drugs.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the chairman of the Health Subcommittee, Mr. Guthrie, for his 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the time. Thanks for witnesses for being here today. I was listening to my friend, the ranking member of the full committee, talk about our motives. We never questioned our motives in the Affordable Care Act. We questioned our methods. I really believe they tried to deliver lower health care costs at affordable prices, and I do believe that it failed. And an example of it we did take money out of Medicaid care and the Affordable Care Act, but enhanced subsidies to health insurance companies for the Affordable Care Act. And so, I mean, I can make the same claim that he's trying to make us with drug manufacturers, that they're doing the same with health insurance companies. Well, they didn't address costs. They just increased the subsidies to health insurance companies. And I don't think they did it to enrich health insurance company executives. That's the result, but I don't think that was their motive. So I think we all got to come, even though we have different methods, we want to do the right thing for the American people. And in the IRA, you know, the concern is just access to drugs. We actually had an HR 1 before, and there was another at the HR 19 that we had. There was bipartisan trying to address the drug prices. I can tell you the drug manufacturing companies weren't excited about all of those. We were going to deal with patents and how long they have patents and how they extend patents and how we get, which is the cheapest way to supply drugs, to get biosimilars and generics to the marketplace quicker. So we're all for that. And so what we're talking about is a pricing scheme that I believe is unconstitutional as well under the takings clause that does result in fewer access to drugs. I think people are just saying that doesn't happen. But Mr. Crowley, a recent Wall Street Journal editorial notes that according to the Galen Institute, 89% of the new medicines introduced between 2011 and 2018 were available in the United States, compared to 62% in Germany, 48% in France, and 40% in Ireland. And you know what I don't like to say, but I say is you can't just pay what Europe pays and not get what Europe gets. And I believe that's where we're headed to this. Would you like to comment? Do you believe, in your view, we're going to have, Mr. Crowley, we'll have fewer drugs available like they have in Europe? I mean, people want to say it's the same. It's not the same.
No, I agree. I think it's important to understand the system that we have here in the United States. It's not perfect, and we need to improve it. We all want the same thing. We want the best medicines, and we want them to get to everybody. We want broad, universal access for everybody in America. We talk a lot about the economic costs. We need to talk about the human costs as well. We work now, we built our company around the world. It was important to get our medicines ourselves, not through a partner. I work in dozens.
How about access in Europe? I'm sorry, I don't have that much time. Access in other countries versus here.
Yeah, I mean, what you generally see around the world is that they make decisions based on economics, and they ration care and people wait. I guarantee, God forbid, if you were diagnosed with a devastating cancer or rare disease, you wouldn't say, my God, I've got to get to Japan. I've got to get to Europe. You don't. The best care is here. We need to make sure it's care for everybody.
Dr. Potts, I was going to ask you the next question, but go ahead if you want to comment on this one.
Yeah, two things. Canada takes 1.5 years longer to actually get the same medications we get here, and that often doesn't come in when you think about prices being cheaper elsewhere, and just how long it takes. Not only, France half as many drugs they ever get, but how long it actually takes them to really finally get approved.
But it's a fair criticism that we subsidize the research around the world, and we need to, in our trade agreements, we need to start focusing on that.
Absolutely.
Instead of just limiting access to Americans to the way that the other people have them move in. So the question is, are we losing access to drugs? I think somebody on the other side of the aisle said, CBO said it's going to be minimal, the effect on innovation. That's just not what CBO said. CBO said at least 10 or cures. We don't know what those are and what they would be. So Dr. Potts, you're a renowned researcher in oncology. We know that Eli Lilly has already changed some investment in early stage cancer treatment because of this imbalance. I'm just going to get to my question instead. Can you talk about the effectiveness of small molecule drugs in treating certain cancers and why divestments in these therapies would be harmful?
Yeah, absolutely. We need small molecules, we need biologics, but small molecules, they're small. They can get into the brain, they can penetrate the blood-brain barrier for diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, et cetera. They also can get into cancer cells, so they can do things.
Why would the IRA prevent some of this from going forward?
Yeah, and they don't forbid it, they just make it completely uninteresting for an investor to invest in. And the money is coming from private investors. This is American venture. This is your retirement funds, et cetera, that's going in this, and it's just making it very unattractive. From 9 years to 13 years, that's where you lose half of your revenue at that time. Healthcare takes a long time to have anything change. We all know that, right? So you introduce a new drug, you get sales, the sales ramp up, and then you suddenly cut it off at 9 years. At 9 to 13 years, you're basically cutting that opportunity to pay back the investment in half.
So do you believe as CBO was quoted, I don't believe that's accurate, that it's minimal? The effect is minimal on
frankly,
innovation?
I was shocked by the number. They said, well, maybe about 1% effect, and it might be in cancer and rare disease. And I just wish that if you just worked 1 month in my industry, I think what you'd realize is, number one, how competitive it is. And we talk about patents. You get a patent on one drug. So lung cancer, you get a patent on that drug, and then suddenly you look behind you, there's 5 other companies developing different drugs with different patents with that same thing, and then you have to justify where your drug is better. Our industry is so competitive, and I think if those of you that have not worked in the industry worked just for a month, you would realize how competitive it is and how well the American system works in this country developing our drugs.
Yeah, then my time has expired. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Appreciate the gentleman yielding back. Now recognize Ms. Dingell of Colorado for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Crowley, you talked about broad access to drugs, and you talked about the human costs, and I agree with that. I'm the co-chair of the pro-choice caucus, I am the co-chair of the pro-choice caucus, but I'm also the co-chair of the diabetes caucus. And when my daughter, Francesca, was 4 years old, I was a brand new member of Congress, she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And you know, it's devastating, as you said, Mr. Czwartacki, I'm sorry, I'm trying. It's devastating to a family. So a couple of years ago, she was on my insurance thanks to the Affordable Care Act all these years, and her insulin was $35 a bottle, or free. And then when she turned 26, she had a good job, but her insulin, as we learned when she went to Walgreens to pick it up, was not on the formulary of her new health insurance. And therefore, she got a bill as a young legal assistant at a law firm for $700 for 2 bottles of insulin, on which she can't live if she doesn't have her insulin. So she then called my older daughter, who's a doctor, and my older daughter said, "Don't worry, we can get you coupons." So she gave her some coupons for her insulin, and her insulin was then reduced to, I think, $450. And eventually she was able to, because we know what to do, she was able to appeal this, and she was able to get her insulin. So what I worry about is that people like Francesca cannot get the drugs that they need. Insulin's not a new, innovative, state-of-the-art treatment for diabetics. It's been around for more than 100 years, and the standard insulins only cost between $3 and $6 a vial to make. I don't think that it's just pharma that has jacked up the price of these regular drugs. I think it's the whole ethos of the health pricing system. And I don't blame, and I don't want to put the blame on pharma solely for these incredibly high prices that cause my constituents and my family members to not be able to get the drugs that they need. But frankly, I'm a little bit offended by the 3 majority witnesses who are here who somehow seem to be implying that we want to stop drug development and we want to stop people who have terrible diseases from being able to access these drugs. If any of you know the work that I did with former Chairman Fred Upton on 21st century cures, you will know we did everything we could to try to expand access to drugs for people. So I will say, I'll get off my high horse, and I will say that we want to work together with all of you and with the industry to keep drug prices low, but to continue development. And the only person who I've heard give a statistic is Dr. Kesselheim, who talked about how the data shows that the incentives will still be there to develop these kinds of drugs we're talking about today. And so I want to ask you, Dr. Kesselheim, why are the concerns that the Inflation Reduction Act may delay the introduction of new cancer drugs unfounded?
Well, first of all, I think that the concerns that a company would have a promising cancer drug that seems to work and then would delay it for financial reasons is ethically ridiculous. And and the companies, I think the people who work at companies also want to help people. And so the idea that they would delay something just to make money that works in patients who have cancer just doesn't comport with any kind of normal, rational, ethical behavior. That being said, even if economically you could try to make the argument that it would make sense to try to delay a rare cancer drug until that drug was approved for a more common condition, it doesn't make sense, because once you get the drug approved, the patents that you have on your product will be closer to expiration, and you're going to get generic or biosimilar competition sooner, and that kind of competition lowers prices far lower than anything that we might expect from reasonable negotiation of fair prices under the Inflation Reduction Act.
Thank you. I think there's a way we can work all of these things out and make these drugs cheaper for my constituents, but I think we all have to work together and stop having the blame game, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, Ms. Lesko of Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you for being here today to testify. And I want to note that Mr. Potts is from my district and in my city that I live in, so it's great for you to be here. You know, drug price negotiation, I hear that from my Democratic colleagues. Let me read about the so-called drug price negotiation under the IRA. If the manufacturer refuses to negotiate and accept the government-imposed price before that price is known, the government will tax a manufacturer's revenue, not profits, but revenue starting at 65% and climbing up to 95% for all drugs sold in the United States, not just those sold to Medicare recipients. Folks, that's not negotiations. Nobody calls that negotiations. That is like saying you have to do it, or you're going to be taxed 95%. At least 24 companies have already made announcements to curtail drug development because of this new law, the IRA. And so, Dr. Potts, as part of the IRA, billions of dollars were diverted from projected Medicare drug savings to pay for unrelated spending, like subsidies for electric vehicles. According to recent polling, over 90% of older Americans believe the IRA's Medicare drug savings should first be applied towards reducing Medicare beneficiaries' drug cost instead of diverting funds towards unrelated spending. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for your service in the great state of Arizona. You know, I really think, you know, our senior citizens are not seeing the damage yet. I mean, they're seeing a very appealing story, which is drug prices have come down. And we're not opposed. I mean, you know, I wish it was 14 years, but 13 years. Insulin, you know, I applaud what the IRA has done to limit costs in terms of these drugs that have been on the market a long time. And I think you're addressing that problem. But help us to incentivize the innovative side of the industry. Make sure we protect and give enough time for us to pay back, you know, in a reasonable period of time, the investment that my investors and John's and others put into this. That's why we need the 13 years. It's so critically important. And I do think that cancer is bipartisan, unfortunately. If it wasn't, we'd probably all switch parties, but it is. And, you know, I think there's a way forward here to move from 9 to 13 and restore the damage we're already seeing with small molecules.
And Mr. Potts, there was allegations made by Mr. Pallone that all Republicans care about is the big pharmaceuticals. Are you a big pharmaceutical company, Mr. Potts?
I've never worked for a big pharma. I've worked for big diagnostics. And again, you spend a month there and you think differently. You're actually in there. You realize how competitive it is, how they kill off things. And everything you do requires investment. It's not just stopping the flow of money that it just kind of magically happens. You have to go invest. But there's 3,000 phase 3 trials across the world right now. ClinicalTrials.gov, you can go there and look. 70% of these are small biotech. And I think we forget that. We just say big pharma. And I get it too. I'm like, oh, you know, my friend Steve works at big pharma, you know. But we don't realize, like, this is American entrepreneurship. It's small business. And yes, when we're successful, you become big. That's fantastic. But we got to reward that. And if you kneecap that and say, look, there's no chance to really pay this back if you actually get there and win, you're not going to have any investor do that. I mean, no one in this room would do that when you look at the actual math of it. So just the system, Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your work, all of your work in helping people. Mr. Czwartacki, as an MS patient and survivor who undoubtedly faces significant medical costs, please give us your thoughts on how drug price controls might impact chronic and rare disease patients.
Well, without the incentives that exist now, by disrupting the medical ecosystem, which, by the way, I love the Congress, we know nothing about how this works, right? You guys lost to F-35. We lost 110,000 Americans last year to opioids. We lost hundreds of millions of dollars in Ukraine, and we're going to find the right price that is developed out of the marketplace over years and years and years. It's insane that you guys can think you can decide what the right price is in the marketplace to get me a drug that I might need in 10, 20, 30 years. So the marketplace does that, and so I don't, that what you're doing is interfering with the whole ecosystem. I can mark your words, in 10 years, this committee will be meeting to talk about having to bail out Big Pharma because China and Seoul and Europe has taken back the lead, and that we've become a laggard, and Americans are known of going from having leading in access to fighting cancers and drugs and cancer and rare disease to the lower. So, and we'll have to bail them out with tax dollars. So why not just take yes for an answer? Just say yes to what's going on. I mean, we can prove it, we can make changes at the margin, but come together. But seriously, take yes for an answer.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, all of you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Ms. Schakowsky of Illinois for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I was here, and three of us in this first end of the row were here in 2006 when we debated the prescription drug benefit under Medicare. And it was, I think, about 3 a.m. where finally a decision was made that added would be the language that said that Medicare could never negotiate for lower drug prices. It was a real battle because we knew what that meant. And I think the chairman of the committee at the time knew. He ended up being the head of Big Pharma, made a lot more money there than he did here. And, you know, we have some numbers that show really billions of dollars went to the benefit of pharma. And of course, we also have mentioned how the VA has for years been negotiating for lower drug prices. And fortunately, our veterans are able to pay far less, while Americans pay 2 to 3 times more for the exact same drugs than people around the world. So I do have a number of questions that I want to ask, and all of them are for, let's see, all for Dr. Kesselheim. So I did just want to mention that even now, I bet there are people out there, seniors, who are maybe standing at the counter at Walgreens or whatever, because I stood behind one of them, who could not afford the drugs that they wanted to have. And people get sick and are dying. And so I wanted to ask you for one, we're hearing all kinds of things, and I want to be sure to say to everyone, we want to be able to find cures. Is it realistic? Is it the truth that the pharmaceutical companies could not, were there to be price negotiations, actually to invest in research and development. We know that they've already spent more money on buybacks and things like that than they have on R&D. So is that the expectation that we could have, that they won't be able to do R&D?
No, I don't think that that's the expectation. I think the expectation is that there are drugs that have already made anywhere, and again, in this year, between $15 and $57 billion already will be sold to Medicare at a slightly reduced price that is negotiated based on the value that the drug provides. And so that money does not necessarily, that doesn't mean that they have to reduce research and development as a result of that. They could reduce those, the income that a large drug company might make could go from into a number of different places. And so I just think that when companies companies stop development on products all the time, and just because they claim that it relates to the IRA in the last couple of months because that happens to be politically beneficial for them, that doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
And don't we also know that they have made literally billions of dollars and in the last couple of years and spent less on R&D than they did on these buybacks, et cetera?
Yeah, there's data that show that large drug companies spend about 10 to 20% of their revenues on R&D as compared to 20 to 30% that they spend on administration and marketing, and about 30% or so on return to shareholders. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a reduction in income necessarily has to come from that 10 to 20% that goes to R&D.
I think that's a really, really important point to make, because there's all these scare tactics. You won't have the drugs that you need. Meantime, I think they are gouging consumers. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank the chairman and thank the witnesses for being here. I've been in many hearings and listened to my Democratic colleagues present what they believe is our perspective on things. And it reminds me of what they used to say about country lawyers. They say, when you have the facts, pound the facts. When you don't have the facts, pound the table. But in this case, when they don't have the facts, what they do is they pound a false narrative. And this idea that Republicans are not for lowering drug prices, not for innovation, is ridiculous. Dr. Potts, in the United Kingdom and England, the cancer survival rates are notably lower than they are in the USA. What do you think is responsible for that? Could it be that they don't have access to some of the cancer drugs that we take for granted over here?
The UK has amazing doctors. We've done some great clinical trials over there, but it's a year and a half or more longer that they get the drugs there versus here. And I don't know the exact percentage, but it might be half or so of what the actual drugs ever that they get, that we get approved here. I grew up in England, and I remember friends that had cancer and did not get care, and we were trying to get them to the United States. Now, that was back in the 80s, but sadly, some of the situation hasn't changed. So we have to take that into account when we think about when we're comparing Europe versus the US. The other thing that's really important here is that you look at net profit in pharma, it's been declining. And pharma puts out clear information on that, their net profit pricing. It's been declining over the last few years. The gross profits have gone up. And someone asked me, Steve, what's the price of your drug? And I said, whatever it is, less than half of that actually goes back to the manufacturers who worked that long to do it. So I do applaud the industry for the groups here today and the bipartisan approach on PBMs. Thank you for that.
Let me expand that point. I've been looking at this quite a while and there's 27 cancer drugs, based on my research, that the National Health System and the UK will not approve, that are readily available here. And I think it's one of the reasons why the mortality rate for certain types of cancer are much higher in England than they are here. Got to get to pronounce Czwartacki. You're nodding. You want to comment on that?
No, I think that we do have a plethora of good options for ourselves here. The system produces a great number. Now, it's not perfect, but it's certainly the best leper in the colony, right? We have the world looks to us for innovations and systems relief for diseases around the world. Now we're turn the whole spigot off. And when we really, the problem is not we have too few options. Not that we have too many, but we have too few. So I think that we need to do what we can to increase the number of innovations. And we talk about how various systems of the government have ways to negotiate, and I don't understand why there are 270 some odd pages in the IRA, and you're spending $30 billion to figure out what the price point is, when if you say VA does it better, we'll just have a line in the budget that says, do what the VA does. Why? Because there's something else of it, and they're really messing with the system they don't really know much about.
What I'm getting at is, and if we want to talk about the overall IRA bill, which was obviously misnamed, intentionally so, I believe, to mislead the American public, is that it's not only the price controls in the bill that's causing a problem, it's the other provisions in the bill that are going to put us in a position where this winter, I'm very concerned that this winter we're going to have a number of people who will be classified as excess winter deaths, much like they've done in England, because you've got people who can't afford their household utility bills. The Economist magazine, back I believe it was in May, reported that there were 68,000 people classified as excess winter deaths in Europe last winter because they could not afford to adequately heat their homes in the winter. And it's particularly problematic for people who have cardiovascular issues, respiratory issues. They didn't freeze to death. They were making decisions on how much they could afford to pay for their household utility bills, which they couldn't afford, in order to continue to pay for their medicine and their food. So I really think this so-called Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, is problematic not only on the availability of drugs and the cost of drugs, but on the ability of people to even afford basic things like food and medicine and household utilities. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Peters of California for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I had a budget markup and couldn't be here for the whole hearing, but I'm glad to be able to catch the tail end. San Diego is one of the 2 or 3 leading biotechnology clusters in the country. We have 70,000 employees in the life sciences. We have 1,000 companies. So some of them, we're proud to have big companies like Eli Lilly or Thermo Fisher or Pfizer. But if it's 1,000 companies, there's a lot of small companies that are really scrappy outfits trying to solve hard science problems with private risk capital. And those are the ones I heard from leading up to the consideration of the bill we passed last year. The NIH, we give about, I'm a strong supporter of the NIH. I think that the research we provide is uniquely suited for the NIH from a public perspective. We spend about $45 billion a year on research at the NIH, and we should probably spend more. But the private sector, the comparable number according in 2018 was $102 billion that the private sector puts into research and development. I understand very clearly that they won't do that. And I'm not talking about big pharma. They have products that they can sell over time. I'm talking about these smaller outfits. They will not invest in such a risky enterprise where 95% of them fail, where it costs $1 billion to get it to market, unless they can make some return. And that was the compromise that I insisted on for my support for the IRA, which I'm very proud of. We gave a time for investors to recover their investment so they'll make that investment again in the United States, not in China where we're competing, who we're competing against. We came up with a bill that does allow negotiation for the first time with Medicare. It does provide a $2,000 cap for seniors over the counter over the course of a year. It limits the price increases to inflation and saves the government a good $200 or $300 billion over 10 years. It was a success. Now, I do understand that when you do something this big, that you can't expect it to be perfect right out of the gate. And so I appreciate your commentary, your testimony on what we may have gotten wrong or what we may want to adjust. I know the small molecule, big molecule thing is a thing I've heard a lot of concern about. I want to hear about orphan drugs. And the thing maybe I'd ask you, I guess Mr. Crowley, maybe you could comment on this. What can we do to make sure that that for drugs that we already know about, we're continuing to do research on other indications for them? And is there something in the is there something in the IRA that you think needs to be adjusted?
Yes, thank you, Congressman, for highlighting that. I think that was a mistake in the IRA, and hopefully we can find a bipartisan fix to that. I know there was just a bill introduced, a bipartisan bill to address exactly that. So what the IRA, excuse me, what the IRA provides currently, you get exempted from the IRA price control mandates if you have one orphan indication. If you develop that drug for a second orphan indication, it could be a very rare disease, you will lose that exemption and you will go into the IRA. So it's a great disincentive for companies to come into that scheme, of course. There was a great op-ed that the CEO, Rachel King at Bio, and Peter Saltonstall at Nord just put out this week. I have it in front of me. It says the IRA needs changes to better support patients with rare diseases. I would implore that this committee and Congress take a look at making this fix to the IRA. When you think about rare diseases, I don't think, hopefully, that's not what was intended, to discourage research, taking a molecule in a program, getting it approved for a rare disease, and then looking into other rare diseases that can be helped. We need to fix that. We need to encourage more and more companies, researchers, institutions to do more of that. Otherwise, it'll be the weakest and most vulnerable with the rarest of diseases who suffer. So please take a look at fixing that.
Dr. Potts, did you want to add anything to that?
I just want to thank you for your support for the industry, and I think also the understanding of the role NIH plays, versus industry. NIH partner, first step, first idea, but then from there, you need the $1 or $2 billion to actually have it become a product. So thank you for that. I agree with the orphan, this designation, but I do think the central piece is that the adjustment from 9 years to 13 years, and I think if we can work on that in a bipartisan way, potentially revenue neutral way, I think it'll also take some of the burden off of the orphan disease area, particularly for small molecules.
Right. Again, I appreciate you coming back with some suggestions on how we can make this bill better. I'm really proud of what we did. I think it's something we had to do. I think there are other points where we should be looking at in terms of cost to consumers and cost to patients. The way the drug prices are negotiated through PBMs, I think is something that this committee is turning its attention to. And I think the way hospitals price things, I think is something else we should be looking at. So I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues on both sides to continue to fight for patients, and I'm proud of what we did in the IRA, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. This conversation is about simple laws of supply and demand that apply to any product, not just drugs. If you impose price controls on a product, you get less supply. It's fundamentally true. It's as true as water rolling downhill. It's always true. So the question is, well, do we care? What are the second, third order consequences of supply going down? What does supply mean in this case? And so supply in the case of drugs doesn't necessarily mean less of a particular drug on a shelf. That's not exactly what it means in this case. What it means is less future drugs. And so you get into this discussion of what will be. And that's kind of a point of contention. I appreciate my colleague, Mr. Peters, who did mention the potential consequences. And then there's some disagreement on how bad those consequences are, I think. And sure, there's exemptions, there's carve-outs, and we're still of the position that the consequences are just too high. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have an unfalsifiable claim, which is that, hey, there's still going to be plenty of innovation. And it's an unfalsifiable claim because I have no way to prove an alternative. Well, because of course you can't. You can't prove that. We can use our knowledge of economics and past history to show that, indeed, there's probably consequences. I would note that in, 1986, of course they took that bullet point away. In Europe, where is it? In 1986, European firms led the U.S. in spending on pharmaceutical R&D by 24%. After the imposition of price controls in Europe, they fell behind. By 2015, they lagged the U.S. by 40%. So policy does matter, and you might make a moral case for it. So if you had all the pills and all the cures you'll ever need to cure anything ever, you might make a good moral case that the government should just buy them all up and distribute them as necessary when people get sick. You might make a good moral case for that. Sort of what happened with the vaccine, with COVID. Now the thing is that's not the case. The truth of the matter is we're We are not at a point in human history where we've cured every disease. We are at a point where we need to keep curing diseases and need to keep investing in research and development. And everything we keep hearing from the people who actually do the work say that they're just going to do it less, or they're going to do it safer. Now, what I mean by safer is economically and financially safer for them. So maybe Dr. Potts, you could comment on that. What kind of investment will this skew? How will this skew investments in the future? What kind of drugs will be so-called will be innovated?
I think, to your example of looking backward, when I started, in the industry in 1999, everyone was screaming about how expensive statins were. It was insane for us to charge so much for these life-saving statins. How much are statins now? And HIV. I mean, we were planning. I remember hearing about it, I was younger, but hospitals to fill up with HIV patients. And then what we've done with AIDS drugs. So think about you have to let the time play out, but these prices do come down. All of my small molecules, I guarantee you that day, they have the recipe, and the day that goes off patent, you can get it from somewhere else. And I do applaud the IRA for what they're doing for making sure that that everything should go generic. We should celebrate things going generic. It means I've done my job. It means that 30 years from now, these drugs will be given out almost like the price of aspirin in a developing country. So I think you just got to see this history play out. Lung cancer, 1999, when I started in the industry, everybody knew there was no point doing a lung cancer drug across the board. If you said lung cancer, they'd laugh at you, like they think of right now with GBM and pancreatic cancer sometimes. Now, there's been so many drugs in lung cancer, but it took, 2000 was the first lung cancer drug, Tarceva. It was an okay drug. Colorado developed that. Now you've got Tagrisso. You think of that's an amazing drug. It avoids chemotherapy. There's a lot of...
What I want to ask you guys, Professor Potts, you can answer this, or Dr. Crowley, you can answer this. So there's different estimates from different studies. The University of Chicago study estimates 135 fewer drugs. I've seen hundreds of drugs. I've seen 15 fewer cures from the CBO. Either way, there's fewer cures, right? Supply goes down. That's the rule. The question is, what kind of cures? So from what you're hearing from industry, is it your more rare disease type of cures? What will be affected? What kind of research will be affected most by this?
Small molecules and rare disease. It's clear. It's already happening.
If I can add, Congressman, it'll be the most difficult diseases to treat, which are going to be the highest risk to develop, and the smallest populations of patients.
Is that childhood
most
oncology?
vulnerable.
Like childhood cancer drugs, things like that?
Pediatric cancer among them, yes.
The irony is, it was just announced that the cancer moonshot, which is, pennies on the dollar, a couple $1 billion of investment, when it takes almost a couple $1 billion of investment for many of these drugs to even make it to the market, period. And meanwhile, passing a law that makes it harder to even develop childhood cancer drugs, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Ms. Miller Meeks of Iowa for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair Griffith, and thank you to all of our witnesses. I'm a physician, former nurse, military veteran, and I came to this hearing actually not wanting to be adversarial, but hearing some of the comments from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle has been demoralizing, to say the least. I'm just going to say the MALA-Democrats, Make America Lose Again Democrats, have already forgotten that without price negotiation in Medicare Part D, we developed $4 generic drugs. Walmart came out with $4 generic drugs. Had there been Medicare price negotiation, Medicare Part D, that would have never happened. I've already met with companies who, with all due respect, saying that generics and biosimilars will bring to competition, but generics and biosimilars also suffer under the IRA and will not come out sooner. And innovation in rare and orphan diseases, places where many of us have worked for decades to get them to the marketplace, whose parent with Alzheimer's is going to suffer, whose child with cancer, whose glioblastoma multiforme or lung cancer is not going to be treated because we will not bring innovation and drugs to the marketplace. What cures will not be advanced because we don't have research and development and innovation in this country, which will go overseas just as the drug market in Europe came to the United States. It seems strange to me to say that as a negotiation with Medicaid, with Medicare, I don't know, is a decapitated horse in your bed a voluntary negotiation? I don't think so. Lower prices, and if you believe my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that this is going to lead to lower costs in Medicare and lower prices for drugs, well, I seem to recall in 2010 hearing that premiums for your health insurance were going to go down $2,500, and if you liked your doctor, you can keep your doctor. And I had patients who could not keep their doctor under that miraculous form that was going to save cost, which did not. So to get off my soapbox now, Mr. Crowley, much of what's not appreciated is precisely what you talked about earlier, and that's the time and cost of the research and development programs that fail, that do not go on to be approved by the FDA and into the marketplace. And can you comment briefly on how some of those programs that your company has advanced ultimately failed, and share with us a sense of the amount you invested in these in time and dollars?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. We at Amicus have invested about $2 billion in research and development and drug programs for our small emerging company. We've had one drug approved in the United States for Fabry disease. We're on the cusp of having a second now approved for Pompe disease. We've had several other diseases that we researched. Epidermolysis bullosa, a genetic devastating skin disease. The skin on these children falls off. We had a program, we invested hundreds of millions of dollars. We really wanted it to work. We thought the science was very strong. It failed its pivotal study. We couldn't move on. We enabled the field, and other drugs have now been approved. We'll obviously never recoup any of that investment. Even in Pompe disease, for the first 4.5 years of our company, we were developing a program. It went in the clinic, and it failed its phase 1/2 study. We had to go back to the drawing board and come up with another idea. It took 7 more years after that to put in the clinic. And all in on that program, I've spent well over $500 million on this second generation program, and we've yet to see any revenue from that product. Hopefully we will. So hopefully it gives you some sense that, when we've heard a lot about big pharma and pharmaceutical companies are an important part of this ecosystem, but really the heart and soul of medical research are our great academic institutions, our biotechnology companies at the core, more than 3,000 companies. So, I'm proud of what we do. We need more science, and we need it faster, and we need it for everybody.
One of the other unrealized deficits in this bill was that CMS released revised guidance clarifying that a drug with more than one designation for a rare disease or condition will not qualify for the orphan drug exclusion, even if the drug has not been approved for additional indications. Unfortunately, by making orphan products with a second designation eligible for drug price negotiation, this provision will disincentivize further investment in rare disease research and development, and even not rare diseases. And I'll give you an example what would suffer under this bill. Avastin, which was a drug that was developed for the treatment of colon cancer, ophthalmologists thought, well, if this drug is affecting the vascular system, perhaps we could use it for wet macular degeneration and save vision. This is a drug that would have been excluded under this provision. And do you know how many people's vision we have saved? How many people we have prevented from going blind and now are leading productive lives and still working because we were able to use a drug developed for one indication for another indication? That is a real-life example of how the IRA fails people. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I don't know the number, but I assume it must be thousands or tens of thousands. I now will recognize Mr. Joyce of Pennsylvania for his 5 minutes and recognize that he, like Ms. Miller-Meeks, is a physician by training.
Thank you, Chairman Griffin, for allowing me to wave on to this critical hearing. I would also like to thank the panel for sharing your testimony on the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act and how that will continue to have effect on new life-saving cures and therapies going forward. The IRA does not include an exclusion for the negotiation program for orphan drugs, and it does in a very limited set of circumstances. When a drug is approved, it is only for one, I repeat, it is only for one orphan drug. Mr. Crowley, does this seem like enough to protect drug development for rare and orphan diseases?
No, thank you, Congressman. It's not, and we've seen the example that was given in the chair's opening comments where they talked about one company, a biotechnology company, Alnylam, up in Boston, was going to start a phase 3 study for a rare cause of blindness, genetic blindness, Stargardt's disease, and they specifically said due to the impact of losing that orphan indication for the one drug that they've developed for one disease, they couldn't move forward. It wouldn't make sense for them to risk being thrown into the drug control pricing scheme. So that's one real example. I'd also give you an example. You look at rare diseases, muscle diseases like Pompe. There are technologies being developed to strengthen muscle. They're being studied in rare diseases like spinal muscular atrophy. It's failed for years. There's finally some promising technologies from some small biotech companies in something like spinal muscular atrophy. If that works, it doesn't get to the underlying biology of that disease, but it could strengthen muscle. And we can apply it to Pompe, to Duchenne, to ALS. There's a huge disincentive for anybody to do that.
And let's utilize the information that's provided to us from the National Organization of Rare Diseases. In their 2021 report, about 25% of the 552 drugs and biologics on the market with an orphan drug designation are approved for more than one orphan indication. Mr. Crowley, can you explain why your company might seek an additional orphan drug designation for a drug that's already approved for one rare disease, and an indication and that impact from the IRA disincentivizing the research, and what impact that will have on patients?
Yeah, you know, more and more in rare disease and human genetic disease, we're understanding common biologic pathways, and we're thinking in different ways. So can we take one drug that's approved for one rare disease that may have some similarities to another disease, or where there's a platform effect, like in muscle disease, and can we apply that to other disorders? We do that because it's the right thing to do, and there's huge unmet need.
And given the unique challenges in developing treatments for the rare diseases, and exploring and defining those platforms where you can have impact, what additional incentives or support mechanisms beyond pricing considerations would be beneficial for companies like yours?
Well, I think, you know, the first kind of goes back to the do no harm. Anything that puts up barriers to innovation, that makes it more difficult, that makes us have to go back to investors, to, you know, we're limited in time and we're limited in capital. Anything that makes us waste time or waste money is going to harm patients because it's going to lead to fewer medicines in our portfolio.
Dr. Potts, this week I introduced bipartisan legislation with my colleague from North Carolina, Representative Dingell, that attempts to address these challenges that are created by the IRA and change the incentive structure within to encourage follow-on investment in orphan drug development by widening the exclusion to include multiple orphan indications. In your opinion, would this bipartisan targeted fix help bring more novel rare disease cures and therapies to market?
I think it is helpful, and I think it's a great idea, and it's also a good example of working together on something to, you know, to improve this. In cancer, you know, we often, in a similar vein to what Mr. Crowley said in rare disease, we'll do this in cancer. We try something, it's interesting in some subtype of lung cancer, and then we might apply it in a blood cancer, and then if it works over there, we might apply it in a subtype of breast cancer. So we're doing a lot of that, especially with molecularly driven diseases. So I do applaud that, but I do think centrally, one of the main pieces I don't want to lose in this is that the 9 years of small molecules. And I think if you do look at that and look very carefully at moving that from 9 to 13 in a revenue neutral way, that will also help alleviate some of the challenges I think we see with the orphan indications and cancer, potentially in some rare diseases as well. So,
and to your point about bipartisanship, this week I also co-introduced the Mini Act as well with Representative Dingell, which would align the timeline for the small molecule drugs that you just mentioned with genetically targeted technology to equivalent to that of large molecules.
Thank you.
These bills both represent common sense and needed changes to ensure that patients are not being harmed. And to the point that you made, and as a physician, I recognize first, do no harm. This is a misguided piece of legislation, and we need to take those additional steps to repair the IRA. Thank you for your insights, Mr. Crowley and Dr. Potts, and to the entire panel for your contributions on this important contribution. Mr. Chair, again, I thank you for allowing me to wave on to this important hearing, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. I will say to the witnesses that you may have noticed that a lot of people came in and out. There was all kinds of meetings going on, and it's amazing we had as many who came and showed up and waved onto the committee as we had. It's because this is an important subject. Seeing that there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I would like to once again thank you all for being here and taking our questions today. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses submit their response within 10 business days upon receipt of those questions. Without objection, committee is adjourned.